Jennifer Card Runners, and I'm here with very important theory concepts part 1. So first off, I want to take a moment to talk about this series. This video will seek to address broad and commonly misunderstood theoretical concepts, many of which I'm getting asked about very frequently in threads and personal messages. These concepts must be understood before we address turn and river play, as the better, since situations get much more complex. This series likely should have been made before any other series. If you already understand theory very well, you will not find this video as useful as you hopefully found some others. I would estimate 95% of viewers do not fall into this category, but surely some do. I did not understand theory well enough when I started making videos to make this video first. And if I had made this video first, many viewers would probably be less confused and have less questions on the more difficult theory videos and Flopzilla videos. Now, just because this theory series probably should have come before a lot of the other ones, it doesn't mean this theory series is going to be easier to watch than some of the other ones. It's probably going to be relatively towards the middle, where it's harder than a series like pre-flop play, but it's probably easier than something like bet sizing. Nevertheless, it's really going to address a lot of the concepts that I talked about in other videos that I didn't realize people were getting confused about. So a good example would be, I'll mention something like, oh, this is a spot where you can profitably bet any two cards, and someone will hear that concept and they'll think, wait a second, when I can profitably bet any two cards, does that mean I should be betting any two cards in my entire range because they're all profitable? Or does that just mean if I did bet my entire range, my opponent could not make any of those hands lose money? So people will get that stuff confused, and I really want to address that in this video. So we'll be talking about a lot of concepts that maybe some of the models we talked about in other videos couldn't take into account very well, and also will hopefully clear up a lot of confusion from the questions I'm commonly getting asked. Skip around this series as necessary. If you understand a concept, don't waste your time and go watch or study something else. I will ask you questions and ask you to pause and answer them or try to solve them. You should do this if you are serious about learning. Okay, so this isn't one of those series where every concept builds off the previous one. So if you skip a concept or two and you go to concept number 3, rather than watch concept number 1 and number 2, you're not going to be lost. So it's okay to skip around during this series. And also, a lot of times I'm going to ask you to pause and write something down on paper or estimate something. You really should do this if you're serious about learning. I know it's very tempting to kind of just run the video and see what I have to say, but if you make a mistake, you will remember something much better than if you just see a range put in front of you on the screen. So here's a quick outline for what I'm sure I'm going to be talking about in this series. Since this series is going to be several videos, I'm probably going to add quite a few concepts, but here's what I know is going to be in the series, at least right now. And in every thread that goes with each video where you're supposed to leave comments or ask questions, I'm going to post where I talk about the different concepts and in what video. So you can't see it right now because I haven't finished recording it yet, but if you wanted to just look up a specific concept, you'll know you can just open up the thread and you can see, oh, that specific concept is in video 2 at the 33-minute mark. So if you do want to skip around, you won't have to watch the entire series. So just know that, look in the thread if you want to see where a specific concept is addressed. So let's just brush over this real quick. First, we're going to talk about algebraic poker math. Next, we're going to talk about why equity cannot be converted into expected value. We're going to be examining what types of equity work in what spots, why this makes using poker software a problem for preflop ranges, and what variables to look for. So what variables can we not just take into account directly in models that we have to pay more attention to, because in real life, in real hands are more complex than models are. Game theoretically optimal players always take the most plus EV line at every point against other game theoretically optimal players. That's pretty important. And we're going to discuss spots which allow the opponent to make plus EV bets with any two cards do not imply we have made a mistake or we're being exploited. So one thing I very often talk about in videos is we know we have to defend enough hands in many spots so our opponent can't bluff with any two cards. For example, if we opened in the cutoff and the opponent called in the big blind, pretty much everyone would agree if our opponent could donk bet on a Jack-9 5 board with a flush draw with a hand like pocket twos, something's going to be wrong there, because that's not a hand where he should be able to donk bet bluff and make a profit, because twos are just a terrible hand there. So we talk a lot about how our opponent should not be able to profitably bluff with any two cards and how often we need to defend because of that, But there are many, many spots where our opponent should be allowed to bluff with any two cards, and just because we get into a spot where our opponent can bluff with any two cards does not suggest we've made a mistake. And then we're also going to talk about adjusting to opponents based on theory, and then we're going to give examples of basic non-intuitive adjustments. So this isn't just going to be stuff like how if our opponent folds too much to bets, we can bluff him too much. This is going to be talking about like if our opponent uses a wider range than he theoretically should, does that make us tighten up or does that make us widen up? Does it make us tighten up in some spots but widen up in other spots? Why? So we'll talk about stuff like that. Concept number 1, algebraic math. After I ask the question, pause and do these on your own. Most of you will not know how to do all of these. You will remember being surprised at how hard it was for you to use basic algebra. You will not remember how to solve a problem just watching me quickly go over a solution. Almost every single student I've ever had for poker does not know how to do important basic pot odd calculations when I first start coaching them. A lot of them are even very good players, but they're used to trying to take all these shortcuts and get an answer very quickly, where they constantly make mistakes and do something they shouldn't have done because they were trying to find a solution quicker than they should have. If you watch one of these videos and you start making a pot odds mistake when you're trying to find ranges, and then that pot odds mistake gives you a bad frequency, that will cause you to make a bad habit and waste a very lot of time. It's extremely important that you take your time and figure out a frequency correctly the first time so you don't start using wrong ranges which cost you money and waste a whole bunch of time. So you really should be careful when doing this. If you do not know how to do these, there are other videos which specialize in pot odds which you can search for and watch. So this is almost like a test. I'm not going to go through slowly and teach you how to calculate pot odds. Question number 1. Our opponent bets $70 into a $100 pot on the river. How often do we need to win to make the call break even? So once again, pause for a moment, do the problem, then come back and resume the video. Answer: 170 times x, because we win $170 at x fraction of the time when we call and win, and then we lose $70 1 minus x, so x equals 0.292 or 29.2%. So we need to win 29.2% to break even on our call. That's why this equation equals 0. It breaks even at 29.2%. How often does our opponent's bluff need to work? Answer: 100 times x. So here we're going to get a different frequency because when our opponent's bluff works, he only wins $100, whereas when our call works, we win $170. Then once again, minus 70, 1 minus x equals 0. So x equals 0.411 or 41.1%. So his bluff must work 41.1%. Write out the algebra when solving problems. You will make tons of mistakes if you do not. I have had MSNL friends make awful ranges and lose money using them because they screwed up the algebra when making these ranges. So I already talked about that. So yeah, so just make sure you understand how to do this. Question number 2. We are out of position on the flop and bet 6 big blinds into an 8 big blind pot. If we bet the turn 50% of the time, how often do we need to check call or check raise the turn so we prevent our opponent from being able to properly call with pure air on the flop, so hands which have 0% equity, if we assume our opponent will bet 14 big blinds into 20 big blinds on the turn? So this one's definitely a bit harder, so once again, pause, try to do it on your own, and then if you can't, just come back and then we'll go over it. Answer: so here's how you should look at this math right here. Look at how much money the opponent loses with his float based on every line you can take. So if you double barrel and bet the turn, he loses 6 big blinds because he floated you on the flop. Then when you bet the turn, he just folds his floats and he lost the 6 big blind flop call. If you check call or check raise, then he's going to lose 20 big blinds because he not only lost his 6 big blind flop call, but you also checked to him on the turn, and then when he bet the turn, you either called or raised, and since he had 0% equity, he lost his turn bet, so he lost 6 big blinds on the flop, 14 big blinds on the turn, for 20 big blinds total, and so your check calling or check raising frequency will be X, and then he will win 14 big blinds when you don't bet the turn, so that's 0.5, and you don't check call, so that's X, so that's going to be 1 minus 0.5 minus X, so that gives us around 12% or 11.8%. So, very important thing to notice, which is you're already sort of, even though your opponent's getting really good odds on the flop, you're only betting 6 big blinds into an 8 big blind pot, So he risks 6 big blinds to win 14. But if you're going to be, check calling and check raising just a bit on the turn, your opponent gets punished pretty strongly when he does float you on the flop. So you don't actually have to check call or check raise very much, because he gets punished pretty severely when you do check raise or check call, and he loses not only his flop call but also his turn bet. Question number 3. Our opponent opens to 3 big blinds in the small blind. We 3-bet to 10 big blinds in the big blind. Our opponent 4-bets to 20 big blinds, and we go all in for 100 big blinds total. How often does our 5-bet bluff need to succeed to make it plus EV if our hand has 33% equity? So as usual, pause, then resume once you think you have an answer. Alright, here we go. Since 200, that's the final pot size, times 33% equals 66 big blinds, we get on average 66 big blinds back when our bluff is called. We thus lose 24 big blinds when the bluff fails, since 90 big blinds minus 66 big blinds equals 24 big blinds. We win 20 big blinds plus 10 big blinds equals 30 big blinds when our bluff succeeds. So, since we're comparing the EV of 5-bet jamming to folding, we only are going to have 90 big blinds in our stack if we fold. So when we go all in and get called, and we on average expect to get 66 big blinds back, that's only 24 big blinds less than we would have had if we folded. Alright, so the answer is 30 big blinds times x minus 24 big blinds 1 minus x equals 0. So x equals 44%. So we need our opponent to fold around 44.4% of the time to our jam to make 5-betting more profitable than folding. You need to know how to do this whether or not you're taking an optimal or exploitative approach to poker. With optimal poker, you maybe will make the statement, my opponent needs to call my 5-bet jam approximately 55.5% of the time, and likewise, if I were villain, I need 55.5% of my 4-bets to be value. With exploitative poker, you may make statements such as, I think my opponent folds 60% of the time to my 5-bet, so my 5-bet has an EV of plus 8.4 BBs when I'm 5-bet jamming with this hand that has 33% equity. So you need to know how to do this math. Whether or not you want to take a very, game theory approach to poker or not, you're going to need to know how to do math like this. While there are a few very good players who are awful at math, even most exploitative players still know how to do enough math that they can calculate the EV of their plays based on their opponent's tendencies. So that's all I'm going to say really for, poker math type of stuff where we're just doing pure math. But just know that it's very, very important that you know how to do this. And a lot of the questions that people get confused about when they're talking about game theory, they might not if they actually knew how to do algebra better. So really focus on making sure you're very solid when it comes to this kind of stuff. Alright, so now that that's out of the way, we're ready to go on to our first concept, which is concept number 1. Equity cannot be converted into expected value. A very, very important concept. Equity represents the probability a hand will be the best hand against a range after the river card has been dealt. Being able to see all 5 cards is an extremely key aspect of equity. It does not tell you how likely you are to outdraw on the flop or outdraw on the turn. It only tells you how likely you are to have the best hand after all 5 cards have been dealt. Some hands are extremely unlikely to draw out against a better hand until the turn and the river have been dealt. While 6-5 suited has 22.5% equity against pocket aces, how likely is it to outdraw the opponent on the flop? Drawing out requires additional cards which are very expensive to see in 3-bet and 4-bet pots. Compare this to pocket 5s, which has 19.1% equity against pocket aces. So, even though 6-5 suited has more equity against pocket aces than pocket 5s, pocket 5s might be much more effective at busting the aces in a lot of spots than 6-5 suited, because 6-5 suited is pretty much going to require you to see at least 4 or 5 cards on the board, whereas pocket 5s will just bust them on the flop most of the time. While the two are correlated, there is no way to express equity in terms of EV. So hold on to that thought for 1 second. We're going to come right back to it. So expected value represents the amount of money we expect to win with our hand against our opponent's range or hand. Expected value takes into account every single possible variable, even those which we cannot express well mathematically in models. So what EV does is it tells us how much money do we actually expect to win with our hand, taking into account every single possible variable. Equity doesn't do any of that. All equity does is tell us how likely are we to have the best hand on the river. It's very tempting to think somehow you can convert equity into EV or into equity, but you can't, and you can't even come close to doing it. There are some times where you're going to have a hand that has over 50% equity, and you're going to have to fold it. There's other times you're going to have a hand that only has 15 or 20% equity, and it's going to be an incredibly clear, super easy call. So a lot of the confusion that people have, and I know it's something that tripped me up for a long time, is thinking there's some way that you can convert equity into EV or EV into equity, and you absolutely cannot do it. The equity of our hand is useful for helping us determine the EV of our hand, but they cannot convert directly, and there are a ton of variables you need to take into account for trying to figure out the most profitable way to play a hand. Not all equity is created equally. Looking at the equity of a hand in Poker Stove isn't always very useful. When we bet, our opponent will fold much of his range. The equity our hand has against his folding range is completely irrelevant. Equity is most useful against the opponent's value range, next useful against the opponent's calling and bluff catching range, and has very little use against the opponent's folding and bluffing range. We are supposed to beat the opponent's bluffs, so beating 80% of the opponent's bluffs once we check the river still won't allow us to call against a balanced betting range. Right, so we really want to ask ourselves when we're looking at the equity of our hand, especially if it's a draw or something like that, we want to ask, is this the type of equity that's going to beat every hand in our opponent's range so we can even beat his value hands? Will it only be able to beat, his check calls if he checks the river? Will it be able to beat but not raise against our opponent's value betting range? How strong, how useful is this equity? Several other factors also affect how useful our equity is, some of which can be very accurately taken into account in models and formulas, and others cannot. It is important not to underestimate or overestimate the usefulness of models and formulas in spots. Obviously, you can make that assumption with EV. A hand that has higher EV than another hand is the better hand because the better hand is expected to win you more money. So EV, more EV is always a good thing. It always means the hand is better. And by better, I mean, of course, more profitable. So variable number one that we're going to focus on, polarized equity. As previously mentioned, equity is most valuable against the opponent's value range, followed by the opponent's calling or bluff catching range, and lastly against the opponent's folding or bluffing range. This should be very intuitive. The opponent will put the most money in the pot with his value range, followed by his calling range, and followed by his folding range. So we've already talked about this quite a bit. Hopefully it's very clear at this point. But either way, we'll go over a quick example. We expect to win our opponent's entire stack nearly 100% of the time when we flop King-King versus 5-5 on a King-7-5 rainbow board because we want all that equity that we have with King-King to actually be against the opponent's value betting range. So here, when we have a ton of equity against our opponent's value betting range, we're just going to win his whole stack. It's awesome. This means hands which retain most of their equity against the opponent's value betting and calling range go up massively in value. For example, a 40% equity flush draw plus gutter on a King of Spades, 8 of Spades, 7 of Clubs board is much better than a 45% equity 5 of Diamonds, 7 of Diamonds hand. Likewise, hands like Ace-7 off usually have much more equity than a hand like 6-5 suited, but Ace-7 off is usually a garbage hand for a variety of reasons, with one of the main reasons being it does not have much equity versus the opponent's calling or value betting range. So, I know when you ask or think about questions like this and you say like why is a hand like a flush draw good, people will usually say, oh, it has implied odds. Or you'll say, why is a hand like Ace-7 off bad? People will say, oh, because it can be dominated, but it's hard to dominate another hand. That stuff's true, but that's not a very mature understanding of exactly what's going on. So the reason why those hands are better, or at least one of the key reasons, is Ace-7 off. It never has equity against the opponent's value betting range. If your opponent is value betting into you and you have Ace-7 off and you flatted it like on the button against a middle position open, you are pretty much just dead when you have Ace-7 off on an Ace high or 7 high board. You lose to your opponent's entire value betting range, and it's not going to draw out against that value betting range. 6-5 suited, its equity makes the hand look like it completely sucks, But when 6-5 suited does make a good hand, you immediately know you have the best hand most of the time, and it's going to retain all that equity against the opponent's value betting range, because when you have trips with 6-5 suited, or you have, a straight with 6-5 suited, it really doesn't matter what hand your opponent has. You beat their hand, whether it's a value betting hand or a bluffing hand. So draws a lot of the time are just so useful because the equity they have beats the opponent's value betting range, whereas made hands, a lot of the equity they have, especially the weaker made hands, they don't beat any of the opponent's value range, and they have very little chance of drawing out and beating the opponent's value betting range. So variable number 1 continued, polarized equity. Polarized equity is equity which will give you either an awesome or an awful hand on a later street. So we just talked about how incredibly that useful is when the hand will beat all or most of the hands in your opponent's value betting range. Those are the very good hands like draws where their EV is much higher than their equity would suggest. Imagine, for example, a hand which flopped complete air 70% and the nuts 30%. The hand would be incredible and so much better than its equity suggests. Take a moment and really think how incredibly awesome a hand would be, despite it only having 30% equity, if on the flop it immediately told you you have the best hand and you will never lose 30% of the time, and the other 70% of the time it just said your hand's awful and it loses to everything. Despite that hand having very little equity compared to most hands that people use pre-flop, it would still be an incredibly good, amazing hand. Unfortunately, even though pocket pairs can flop a set which has a ton of equity against the opponent's value range, they still waste a massive amount of equity folding to the opponent's bluffs and being unable to successfully bluff themselves. So imagine a pocket pair, for example. Pocket pairs usually actually have quite a bit of equity pre-flop, whereas the hand that I was just talking about, the hand that flops complete air 70% and then nuts 30%, only has 30% equity. Pocket pairs usually have quite a lot more equity than that. The problem is, even though pocket pairs have one part of their, flopping range, which kind of works like the way we were talking about, which are sets, because sets just don't really care what your opponents have. A set's pretty much going to beat just about anything in your opponent's range. The problem is pocket pairs also flop the best hand. Pocket fives will be the best hand on an ace 7-4 board, and you're not going to be able to play it effectively. You're not going to know whether or not you have the best hand. So even though pocket pairs can flop that sort of nutted component that plays really, really well, they unfortunately end up wasting a ton of equity everywhere else because the hands play horribly as bluffs and horribly as check calls. So even though pocket pairs are going to have a lot of equity against the opponent's, flopping range, even when they miss, the equity they have plays absolutely atrociously. So keep all this stuff in mind as we move forward and we start talking about other variables to look for when we're trying to talk about, how to assess the EV of our hand. And just keep in mind, I'm not trying to suggest pocket pairs aren't very useful hands and very good hands in many spots. I'm simply saying don't get confused and think pocket pairs are anywhere near as effective as this imaginary hand I was just talking about that has 70% air and 30% nuts on the flop. Pocket pairs are nowhere near that effective at actually, being able to realize all their equity, because we're still going to end up check folding the best hand when we have pocket pairs a lot and not going to be able to bluff it effectively when we do have the worst hand. Variable number 2, streets left to act. When a player bets post-flop, they almost always represent a polarized range. The ratio of value bets to bluffs and the frequency the opponent will ultimately end up having to show down depends drastically based on how many streets are left to act. If we bet 0.75 pot-size bets down the river, we need to be value betting 70% of the time to make our opponent indifferent to calling. If we bet the turn with a perfectly polarized range for 0.75 pot-size bets, we'll want to bet the river 70% of the time. In practice, we'll sometimes river a medium-strength hand in check and bet the river for value 70% of the time if we bet 0.75 pot-size bets. 70% times 70% equals 49%. If we bet the flop, we'll want to bet the turn around 70% of the time, so 70% times 70% times 70% equals 34.3%. So we've talked about this a lot in other videos, and we've usually talked about it from the perspective of the bettor. How if we're betting on the flop, we're going to have a whole ton of bluffs. If we're betting on the turn, we're going to have around a 1-to-1 ratio of value bets to bluffs, give or take depending on the board texture. And then on the river, we're going to have to be very weighted towards value, because as you can see right here, even for a 75% pot size bet, which is pretty big, we still need to be betting the river for value 70% of the time once we bet. So it's really important to not only think about these ratios and these frequencies when you're the better, but also when you're the caller. Because when your opponent's betting, usually both in theory and in practice, he's going to be representing a pretty polarized range. Since people bet too much in practice at lower limits especially, people are probably betting with a lot of hands they shouldn't be. But for the most part, they're still going to be betting, their strong hands and their bluffs. So if you're calling on the flop, you can be calling with hands that only have sort of a smallish chance to river a really, really good hand, because in order to win on the river after your opponent kept betting, you're going to need to have a very strong hand. Yet if your opponent checks, he's usually going to be checking with the intention of check folding, because he had a polarized range. He's mostly going to be letting his bluffs drop out when he checks, and they'll be check folding. He'll sometimes check call when he turns a river a medium strength hand, and he'll sometimes check raise. But for the most part, once someone checks after they bet the previous street, their check folding frequency should be very, very high. So you really want to think to yourself while you're playing, how much am I actually going to have to show down based on what street I'm on? Because that will get you out of the habit of thinking your hand strength is heavily correlated to the amount of equity it has. Remember, equity does not tell us how much EV our hand has. So if we're in a spot where we're only going to have to felt a small portion of our range, but we can win a really, really big pot when we do have a strong hand, then sort of a backdoor flush draw plus straight draw, some sort of gut shot hands are going to work very well. Likewise, in that same spot, a pocket pair might have a really lot of equity, but the pocket pair is not going to call down very effectively, and it's also not going to work very well as a bluff when the opponent checks. So that hand might have a lot of equity on the flop, even though its EV is going to be a negative EV when you call with the hand, because it works so poorly as both a calling hand, and if you're going to bluff it later on, it really doesn't matter what bluff you have. Pocket pairs are pretty much drawing, for the most part, drawing dead when the opponent checks calls, and if you had to turn it into a bluff, then its showdown value wasn't very useful anyways. So really think about how many streets are left to act when trying to decide whether or not the hand's worthy of calling or even bluff raising. Variable number 2, continued, streets left to act. Likewise, when facing a 0.75 pot size bet, we will usually want to call around 60% of our range in spots where our opponent should not be able to profitably bet any two cards. If our opponent bets flop, turn, and river, we end up calling down 60% cubed equals 21.6%. If our opponent bets two streets, we call 36%. And if our opponent bets one street, we call 60%. So once again, we've talked about this in other videos. This isn't anything too new. But remember, this is only what we would need to defend if we did not want our opponent to be able to profitably bet any two cards. So if you bet the flop, and you bet the turn, and you check the river, that's not a spot where your opponent shouldn't be able to profitably bet any two cards, because he's not guaranteed you're going to check the river, and you had to risk money to maybe get into a profitable river spot if you floated on the turn. So don't confuse spots where your opponent very clearly should be able to profitably bet any two cards with spots where he shouldn't, because if you get that confused, you're going to end up using a very poor range. So think to yourself, is this a spot where my opponent took a big risk to get here? Is he guaranteed to get here? Because if your opponent took a big risk to get into a spot, and if he's not even guaranteed to be in that spot once he took that risk, such would be the case if he floated your turn bet, then it's not going to be a problem if when you do check the river, you check fold enough that he can bet any two cards, because he already took such a big risk, and he's not always going to get to make that bluff. When our opponent checks, we'll usually want our hand to function well as a bluff, or be able to check down and win at showdown. On the flop and turn, the quality of our bluff matters tremendously, especially if we don't need to flat a huge portion of our betting range. So that's one of the biggest aha moments I ever had when I was learning how to play poker, is you really just start to realize if you don't have a great read, you randomize your bluffs and you randomize your calls based on the better hands you have in your range. So that's all this is saying here, which is on the flop and the turn, that's very important to do. On the river, all bluffs are equal other than usually very small removal effects. So on the river, it matters much less what kind of hands you're calling with and what kind of hands you're bluffing with, because when you're bluffing, you don't have a chance to improve, and when you're calling for the most part, you're going to beat all your opponent's bluffs and you're going to lose to all of his value hands. So on the river, it's sort of less important to randomize well on the river than it is on the flop and the turn. If you think you have, a way to exploit your opponent on the river, you're going to have a lot of hands which are pretty much exactly the same practical hand strength. This results in hands which make mediocre checking hands and mediocre bluffs being much weaker than their equity would suggest. Nine of clubs, nine of hearts on a king of spades, eight of hearts, six of hearts flop is a great example of this. The hand hates giving free cards when checking back to get to showdown, but also functions poorly as a bluff. So it's very important that when you are picking what kind of hands you want to randomize your calls with or you want to randomize your raises with, you really ask yourself, is this hand going to play effectively in the way it's usually going to be played? So a hand like pocket nines, it's in some spots it's going to be a really easy call. Don't get me wrong. I don't want you to think you should be folding nines on every king 8-6 board. But for the most part, especially if you're up against a very strong range, nines don't really like checking back and giving the opponent two free cards, because then even when the opponent has a hand like Jack 10, they're going to draw out something like 28% of the time, maybe even more than that if they have some backdoor flush draws. So it doesn't love giving free cards or anything, but by the same token, if you think, oh, well, my opponent checked on the turn, so he's mostly going to be check folding, and that will be true, when you use pocket nines as a bluff on the turn, they don't really do anything. Now you just kind of call with a hand where you're going to bluff it on the turn, yet it's not going to get calls from any weaker hands, and it's for the most part not going to make any better hands fold. I mean, it could make something like tens or jacks fold on the turn, depending on the turn card, but it overall plays very poorly as both a calling hand that has, a calling hand that might improve and can get turned into a bluff, and as a calling sort of medium strength hand, which can get checked back. So nines on this board just aren't going to work that well. Whereas if you took a hand like 9-10 of spades, 9-10 of spades will almost certainly have much less equity on the flop than pocket nines, but 9-10 of spades is going to be awesome because the 7 gives us the nuts on the turn or the river, and any spade gives us a flush draw, and any jack gives us an open-ended straight draw as well. And then if we do turn a 9 or a 10 with our 9-10 of spades, it also now might make a really good hand to bluff raise on the turn, or maybe it can call again. So 9-10 of spades is going to be a hand that just plays so incredibly well. It's going to be so effective at what it does, whether or not it's double floating, both on the flop or the turn, whether or not it turn or river the nuts, or whether or not we bluff raise it on the turn. 9-10 of spades is really good at what it does, and we know exactly what we're going to do with it. Pocket nines, not very good at what it does, both turning it into a bluff on the turn or checking it back are both not ideal. Variable number 2, continued, streets left to act. So I usually make the slides for these series maybe a week before I record them, so I just record them whenever I have time. So I didn't realize that everything I talked about in the last slide, where I thought I was going beyond the slide and commenting on what I wrote, I actually pretty much wrote that stuff on the next slide. So I didn't want to go through it all again step by step, but if you do want to sort of freeze the screen and read it, you're more than welcome to. The one thing I just wanted to point out is I like the way I said this right here. We will only end up having to felt 21.6% of our flopping range if our opponent bets all 3 streets. Draws can improve and be part of that 21.6% range, and strong made hands can call down when the turn and the river blank. What can 9-9 really do? So that's just a way I sort of like to visualize it, that a draw is likely going to improve and become part of that range, and a very strong made hand will likely be able to call down. Pocket nines doesn't really do either. So you're still going to have to a lot of times call with hands you're not thrilled about calling with, but really ask yourself, is this a hand that works well? Because you might find a hand that has a lot of equity, like a pocket pair, actually will work a lot worse than a hand that is a backdoor straight draw and backdoor flush draw. It's really going to depend on the board texture, because you're going to need to make sure your range isn't just super weighted towards these little draws, but for the most part, really think. And once again, in both of these cases, the equity of the hand against the opponent's betting range is not a good indicator for the EV of the hand. So make sure you're not just calling with made hands just because they have more equity. Really think if a sort of weak draw would work better, if it will let you bluff and play the turn in the river much more effectively. Variable number 2, streets left to act. In general, a hand's equity is a better indicator of its EV on later streets than on earlier streets. It is impossible to make a hand with 52% equity against a betting range indifferent to calling on the river. It is difficult to make a hand with 52% equity against a betting range indifferent to calling on the turn. And it is very easy to make a hand with 52% equity against a betting range unable to call a flop bet. So this is not one of those rules that you should just be thinking about and having this rule determine what hands go into your range. But it is something sort of interesting to note, that if you have a hand with a lot of equity on the river, there's not much your opponent can do. If you have if you have a hand with a lot of equity on the flop, there's a lot your opponent can do to still make that hand very, very bad and unable to even call. So just something to think about and make sure you really understand. More streets left to act mean more implied odds for hands which can hit some very big turn or river cards. That's kind of obvious. Remember, draws do not function like bluff catchers do when facing bets. An open-ended straight draw plus flush draw with 52% equity is super plus EV because it retains all or most of its equity against the opponent's value betting and calling range. So once again, that's what it pretty much all comes down to in the end. We want hands that have equity against our opponent's value betting range and against his bet calling range. We could jam an open-ended straight draw plus flush draw with 52% equity against the opponent's flop betting range and know it'll almost always still be plus EV. If we did that with a pocket pair with 52% equity, we'd get destroyed. Because when we jam an open-ended straight draw plus flush draw, almost all of that 52% equity will stay 52% equity even if our opponent has a super strong range, because the flush draw or the straight draw will still almost always be the best hand. When we jam with a pocket pair, our opponent's range will change drastically. So now when he bets and we jam, he's only calling with a very, very strong range, and the pocket pair will get completely ripped apart by it. So it's just so important to realize what type of equity you have. Does this equity beat my opponent's value betting range on some turns and rivers? Variable number 3, hand signaling. Another term I made up because I love making up terms. Hand signaling occurs when a hand tells us we want to see additional cards since we'll likely draw out. Example. Pseudoconnectors usually are great at allowing us to know we need to see the turn or the river. Flushes, straights, two pairs, and trips don't usually appear out of nowhere. We'll know if we have some combination of 3 to a flush, 3 to a straight, or a pair on the flop. This allows us to make sure we actually see the turn and the river when we draw out on the turn and the river. In other words, we're able to realize our equity very effectively with pseudoconnectors because when our equity is very low, we fold, and when it's higher, we either can call or bluff raise effectively. So this is a very important concept, and I know I keep saying every concept is very important, but they pretty much are. But this is a very important concept, and it's one that confused me for a long time. Because when you're just looking in a computer program, you'll often just look at the equity of your hand and you'll think, oh, that equity is telling me what my better hands are here. It doesn't actually tell you how effective you're going to be at realizing that equity. So when you have a pseudoconnector, a straight, or a flush, those hands don't just appear out of nowhere. You can see on the flop whether or not you have 3 to a straight, 3 to a flush, 4 to a straight, or 4 to a flush, and you know, hey, I have a reasonable chance to outdraw my opponent, so you make sure you see the turn or the river card. So it's pretty rare, at least in a raised pot, especially when you're in position, which is where you'll usually have pseudoconnectors, it's pretty rare you have a hand that would have drawn out, but you don't get to see the turn or the river card because you're very much aware that that draw is there. So you're sure you see the turn or the river with those hands. Whereas if you have other hands, you might not have a very good chance to outdraw, so when you would have turned or rivered the best hands, you've already folded at that point and you don't get to realize your equity. So that concept makes pseudoconnectors very, very good and much better than their equity would suggest. Variable number 3, hand signaling. An example of a hand which is terrible at signaling, pocket pairs. When we look at how likely a pocket pair is to beat an overpair, we see it has around 20% equity. Yet how likely are we to actually see the turn or the river card if we were to draw out on a later street? Almost never, because we have a 5% chance to drill the set on the next card. This is much less effective as if we had a 50% chance to drill 1/3 of the time, since if we did, we could just fold the 2/3 of the time we had a 0% chance and call or bluff raise when we had a 15% chance. So it's just something that's really important to realize. It's a lot better to have a hand that gives you a 15% chance to draw out on the turn, and then to have an air hand, a complete air hand twice that you can just fold, than it is to 3 times have a hand which has a 5% chance to draw out on the turn. You're able to, if the equity is distributed this way, where we have 15% equity 1/3 of the time, it's very easy to just see the following card when you have this 15% equity hand and then fold the other 2 times. But if you have 3 hands which all have 5% equity, you end up having to pretty much just fold them all, and obviously that makes you just throw away all that equity. So you really want to think about, how well does this hand distribute the equity. The effects of this are quite strong. Pocket pairs have much more equity than pseudoconnectors and tell us immediately how strong our hand is on the flop. Yet pseudoconnectors are still often better than pocket pairs due to signaling. It makes sense that we need a mixture of hands in our calling range since each type of hand does things well. Suited connectors are good at what they do, pocket pairs good at what they do, etc. But once a large fraction of our range consists of one type of hand, we will often run into problems. We need good bluff raises, value raises, floats, medium made hands, etc. Lacking a certain type of hand or having too much of one type is usually bad. So let's just think about this for a moment. If we had a range that's very weighted towards pocket pairs, it would flop a lot of really, really strong hands, but it would usually completely miss the flop. So that would make balancing out our value raises with bluff raises quite difficult, because now we'll still have flopped some, really strong sets that might want to raise on a very drawy board, but we might not have the hands in our range that work well as bluff raises. Likewise, if we only call with suited connectors and we fold all of our pocket pairs, it's very hard to hit any really, really strong hands in our range that can raise, because it's just very unlikely that suited connectors flop really, really good on the flop. Those are the hands that usually need to, see additional cards, so they work very well as floats or as bluff raises. So it's very important that ranges are balanced and that they can do all sorts of things well. They can flop medium strength hands, they can flop value raise hands, bluff raise hands, they can flop floats. And when I say floats, I usually mean, like 3 to a straight, 3 to a flush, that sort of type of thing. So it's very important to have a balanced range because, a set, when you flop a set, it will want to be balanced by being raised with a suited connector that works well as a bluff raise. So it's important to use all the sort of hands that you can use in your range. So when you are deciding whether or not you should be calling with a hand pre-flop or on the flop, you should really know what type of hand it is and what it's going to allow you to do. So there are going to be some flop textures where in order to get a hand that can make a good bluff raise on the turn to maybe balance out your slow played sets on the flop, it's going to be a bit of a stretch. You're going to have to call with a hand on the turn you're going to have to call with a hand on the flop that doesn't look like it should be a call, because if you don't call with some of those types of hands, you're completely lacking that hand type on the turn, and then when you want to value raise, you're not going to have any sort of bluff raises that work well. So it's very important to think, especially on the flop, is the range I'm calling with consisting of all these different types of hands? Is it not just me calling with the 60% best hands in a vacuum? Do the hands make a balanced range? So when I say it's very important, I mean in theory, and I'm sure against very good players. I don't mean it's a big deal if you're just grinding no limit 50, that you have to have a balanced range. But it is important to think about that kind of stuff when you're trying to get better. Exactly how important it is to balance is really going to depend on the board texture and your opponent. But for the most part, whenever you are bluff raising, you want to make sure you have the best bluff raise possible, because even if that bluff raise only draws out 5% more likely than a worse bluff raise, that's still 1 out of every 20 times you're going to win a massive pot. So try to randomize well when you can. Try to use the right types of hands for bluff raising, but if you are playing very low stakes, it's probably not going to be a big deal if you are a little bit too weighted towards value or a little too weighted towards bluffs on some board textures. You don't need to freak out if your range isn't perfectly balanced with the right fraction of all these different types of hands. Variable number 4, equity relative to pot size. We need to pay attention to how much equity our hand has relative to the size of the pot. Sometimes our hand will have the perfect amount of equity to bluff jam or a terrible amount of equity to bet fold. Oops. This is especially important in 3-bet pots, where it's extremely difficult to bet fold on later streets. Being faced with a near break-even call with a high equity hand is one of the worst things that can happen to us in poker. We should be doing everything we can to avoid these spots, especially in practice where being unbalanced or using slightly different sizings isn't going to allow the vast majority of our opponents to exploit us. So this is a concept which I think is incredibly important to be able to understand and apply well in practice, because it is very, very bad when you have a high equity hand that faces pretty much a break-even call when your opponent jams. And I know from experience, I've played around with Flopzilla and I've found spots where, hey, in this spot right here, it might not make a lot of sense for my opponent to raise, so I can bet a hand that really hates getting raised. Your opponents aren't going to be playing theoretically optimal, so you might play against an opponent that's going to raise you in that spot, even if it's not a very good spot to raise. If that's the case, you're going to have to see if you can take, an alternative line or use a different sizing that doesn't hate getting raised as much, because even if it's a bad raise in theory for your opponent will still be pretty likely to do it if he has, stats that you can see on your HUD that suggest he has a high turn raise or a high river raise or something like that. So this is a very, very important concept to be able to apply well in practice, because you are going to face bets, or you are going to face raises in spots where maybe your opponent shouldn't be betting or raising, that make your hand very difficult to play. Variable number 4, continued, equity relative to pot size. Some common examples. Betting 25 big blinds into a 50 big blinds pot on the turn in a 3-bet pot with a flush draw. We need 25% equity to call if our opponent jams, and our hand usually has around 20 to 25% equity. I hate this spot so incredibly much. I try very hard to avoid it against opponents who I think are very likely to jam the turn in a 3-bet pot. So that often results in me check raising all in on the turn too much when I have a flush draw in a 3-bet pot. It might sometimes require me to bet a little bit smaller than I would like to on the turn in the 3-bet pot. There's ways to get around it. It's usually going to be pretty exploitative what you think you can and can't do, though. Number 2, 4-betting a strong hand preflop, which is slightly plus EV 4-bet, but a much more plus EV call. We usually want to flat 3 bets with hands like ace, queen, and 10s on the button, despite the fact that they can 4-bet and call profitably. They play better in 3-bet pots than 4-bet pots, and the opponent is unlikely to felt many worse hands. So that's something that everyone's probably very comfortable with. They've all seen, someone make a thread where they 4-bet or 3-bet with a hand like ace, king, or jacks in a spot where they probably shouldn't be, and then they say, oh man, I don't know what to do when I got 4-bet, or I don't know what to do when I got 5-bet. Now, there are times when you're going to want to exploitatively, 3-bet or 4-bet and then fold a hand like ace, king, ace, queen, jacks, or something like that. But for the most part, you want to try to avoid these spots if you're not going to know what to do when your opponent puts in the next raise or when he puts in a jam, because your hand's going to have right around the right amount of equity where it both hates calling and hates folding. So try to avoid it if you can. Raising the flop with marginal draws usually puts us in a terrible spot when the opponent 3-bets. It's usually a bad idea to raise a weak flush draw like 9 of hearts, 8 of hearts on a queen of hearts, 6 of hearts, 4 of clubs board. So this is a spot where you might be playing around with Flopzilla and you find out, hey, if I raise on this board, since we only have 100 big blind stacks, and when I raise I'm representing such a polarized range, my opponent really shouldn't be 3-betting me on this board very often, because if my opponent does have a set, he probably is going to want to consider slow playing it, because that way I can keep bluffing. And if he doesn't have a set, his hand's probably not going to be strong enough to re-raise me, because even a hand like kings or aces might not be strong enough to re-raise if your raising range on this board consists only of like pocket 6s, pocket 4s, a bunch of bluffs, and some flush draws. Nevertheless, when you think about it, especially at really low stakes, your opponent's probably not used to playing against players who bluff raise a lot. So if you are one of those few players, he probably will think your range is more weighted towards value than it is. So when he has a hand like pocket aces, or when he has a hand like pocket 6s or pocket 4s, he might get excited, he might overvalue his hand and decide he wants to just 3-bet now and get as much money in as quickly as he possibly can before some turn card comes and scares you. Likewise, he might also have a hand like ace 10 of hearts or ace jack of hearts, or even a hand like king 10 of hearts, which maybe is a hand that should consider calling, but he will want to 3-bet it, because when he 3-bets it, he knows, oh, I can make a really big 3-bet on the flop, and that way if my opponent calls, I jam the turn, or if he goes all in, I call, and I'll never have to face a tough decision. So it's very important when you have a hand like ace 9 of hearts to really think about, is my opponent going to actually 3-bet me a lot on this board? Because if he is, you definitely don't want to raise it. If he's not, you might want to consider raising some weak flush draws in your range for sort of a balanced thing to give you a variety of hands that you're raising. But if the opponent is going to 3-bet a lot, it's for sure a hand that you don't want to raise with, because then when you get 3-bet, you're put in a very gross spot, because your opponent's usually going to be value 3-betting, and when he is 3-betting, he's also going to have some draws that dominate you. So even if a hand is a raise in theory, if it's one that's going to hate facing a 3-bet, really ask yourself, okay, even though this is a spot where my opponent shouldn't be 3-betting very much, in theory, in practice, is he going to? And the answer will often be yes. One quick thing, I also realized when I said 8 of hearts, 9 of hearts, it sounded like I was saying ace of hearts, 9 of hearts. Obviously, I meant 9 of hearts, 8 of hearts, the hand that I have on the slide, not ace of hearts, 9 of hearts. Ace of hearts, 9 of hearts would be a very good hand to value raise if we thought our opponent was likely going to be 3-betting some like king 10 of hearts, king jack of hearts. So, sorry about that if that caused any confusion. Variable number 4, continued, equity relative to pot size. In theory, it likely makes sense to have multiple different bet sizings in spots. Even if we do not balance our betting range in practice, there are very few players good enough to read heavily into different bet sizings and exploit us, and those who are, we should be able to recognize. If we can't bet fold or bet call our hand effectively in a 3-bet pot, can we bet bigger on the flop and jam the turn with a balanced range instead? Can we find other hands to randomize our bluffs with that don't face a tough decision when we get re-raised yet still have a reasonable chance to draw out? So let's stick with the 3-bet pot example because it works so well. If you're like most players, you probably have a single bet sizing you used when you're continuation betting in a 3-bet pot, which is based on the flop texture. In theory, that's almost certainly not correct. You would have multiple different bet sizings in that same spot, and each would be using a balanced range. So, if the board is very drawy, and you're going to hate having to bet fold or bet call on the turn with a draw, that might be a hand that makes a really big continuation bet on the flop, so it can jam the turn as a really effective bluff. You might balance that with betting some very strong yet very vulnerable made hands on the flop. Like maybe if you flop bottom 2 pair, that will want to bet pretty big on the flop and really big on the turn because bottom 2 pair is very vulnerable, or a weak overpair is very vulnerable. So you could have a balanced betting range that bets very big on the flop and allows you to jam the turn, and a balanced betting range on the flop that bets much smaller and is planning on using all 3 streets. So a range that might want to bet all 3 streets would consist of bluffs that aren't going to hate bet folding the turn, and might consist of value betting hands that are so incredibly strong they're not afraid of letting the opponent see 2 more cards, because if you flop a set in a 3-bet pot, you're extremely unlikely to be outdrawn. So that would be, I think, a pretty common example. In a 3-bet pot, bet really big with your sort of good draws and vulnerable strong hands, and bet small with hands that are super, super, super strong, or bluffs that aren't going to hate bet folding. But in theory, rather than just even having those 2 bet sizing structures, you could have just dozens and dozens and dozens. So maybe in theory you would have, a range that bets super big on the flop, a range that bets big but not too big, a range that bets medium, a range that bets small, and a range that bets very small, and all of those ranges would be balanced. But in practice, no one's really good enough to do that. Even if you're able to just balance 2 bet sizing ranges, that will be very, very useful. Variable number 5, implied odds. Some turn and river cards hit our opponent's range harder than ours, so we will bet them a disproportionately high amount of the time. This results in us getting paid more when we make a hand on a turn or river card that is ultimately bad for our range. For example, suppose we flatten the small blind against a button open and the flop comes 10-5-4 rainbow. If we check call on the flop with king-queen and turn a queen or a king, we are very likely to get additional bets from our opponent since it appears to hit his range better than ours. Very obvious concept, which is already discussed in most other videos. So I'm not going to talk about this concept much at all. This is the only slide I made for it. But just keep in mind that it helps when you call with hands that are going to hit you very well on cards that hit your opponent's range better than yours. Because when the card hits your opponent's range better than yours, those are the board textures where he's going to keep betting, and he's likely going to be value betting a worse hand, and you're going to make a lot of money. So it's important when you are trying to check call, bluff raise, or just defend your range that you want to make sure you're using hands that can hit on turn or river cards which look like that turn or river card missed your range. Other huge variables I am not touching with a 10-foot pole. Position. Position usually gets more valuable as the board gets more coordinated and as stack sizes get deeper. Overall stack depth. Stack sizes change the expected value of hands greatly. As can be seen, the variables we've talked about are clearly not independent. And what I mean by when I say they're not independent, I mean you don't just look at position as being some isolated variable or overall stack depth being some isolated variable. Position will be more valuable as things get deeper. Having a deep stack will be more valuable when we're in position. So you want to think about how variables affect one another, because the other 5 variables we've talked about are also affected by, either position or overall stack depth. You really want to think about their overall effect when you're designing your range, the effect of all the 7 variables we've now mentioned. Now, the reason why I'm obviously not going to go into detail about position and overall stack depth was the other variables we've talked about are very important, But those are also variables that we could talk about a little bit more quickly, and are variables I think a lot of people get confused about, and I don't see them talked about much on forums. People tend to talk a lot about position and overall stack depth, and while I don't think people always do a good job explaining the value of position from a theoretical perspective, it's not something I'm going to be able to have time to do right here. So maybe in the future I'll make a series or a video about position, but right now it's just something that, you obviously know from experience. Position is very valuable, very useful, but we're not going to be able to go into detail. Wrapping up concept number 1, equity cannot be converted into EV. This is not an exhaustive list. Nevertheless, they are concepts that need to be taken into account when a model does not take them into account. Usually, they will not greatly skew the results of the model, and many of the effects go both ways. For example, we usually assume our bluffs will sometimes get a great turn or river and become the nuts, and other times our very strong hands will get a bad turn or river and get stacked. Models usually give us a reasonable range of values, and we need to be able to tweak the frequencies and ratios based on these other factors the model cannot directly take into account. For example, when I bluff raise in position, I usually want between 1.5 to 2 bluffs for every strong made hand I value raise. A raising range illustrates the concepts I'm talking about quite clearly, because a raising range won't have 100% or 0% equity. Sometimes the weaker hand will outdraw, and sometimes the stronger hand will be outdrawn, and that effect of course goes both ways, as I just mentioned. Sometimes we'll have the weaker hand that outdraws our opponent, and sometimes we'll have the stronger hand that gets outdrawn by our opponent. So if we were raising the flop with a range that had hands which were 100% equity and hands which were 0% equity, we wouldn't need to have this sort of 1.5 to 2 bluff range. We would know exactly how many bluffs we want for every value bet on the flop based on our bet sizing. We could get an exact number. But since there are these other little variables that we can't take into account, we can still use math to get an overall general idea of how many bluffs we want for every strong hand, but we're not going to get an exact number, and exactly how many bluffs we should have for every value bet will depend on those other little variables we've already talked about. For example, if our bluffs are very good at hand signaling, if our bluffs are very good at letting us know we should be double barreling the turn when our bluff improved and made a better draw, that's going to let us bluff more on the flop because we know those bluffs are going to play very effectively on the turn. If those hands were not very good at signaling, then we'd probably have to bluff a little bit less. We also want to think about the implied odds of our bluff. Maybe our bluffs are going to improve on turns or rivers, which our opponent's going to likely put a lot of money in on the pot. That makes our bluffs better. There are other variables which the model was already able to take into account directly. So if we're designing a bluffing to value raising ratio on the flop, we already know how many streets there are left to act, so the model can take that into account directly when it gives us this range of between 1.5 to 2 bluffs for every strong made hand. So it's very important to realize models usually give you a very, very good estimate, but it doesn't play poker for you. You're still going to have to tweak your ratios and your frequencies based on the flop, turn, or river texture. We also can take into account other variables with additional parameters. There will usually be multiple parameters telling us what we can and cannot do with our range at the same time. So let's look at this parameter right here. We want between 1.5 to 2 bluffs for every strong made hand we value raise on the flop. That tells us our bluffing to value raising ratio. Awesome. That does not tell us how strong a hand needs to be before it can effectively value raise. So when we are trying to figure out what we should do with our range, there's usually multiple things restricting what we can and cannot do at the same time, and it's important to take them all into account. So for designing a bluffing to value raising range on the flop, we need to think about what our ratio should be, and we need to think about how strong our hand needs to be to value raise. Those are two very important parameters that work together to tell us what we can and cannot do. Okay, so that's been about an hour, so we're at the end of the video. I hope you enjoyed it, and I look forward to reading your comments and questions in the thread. So good luck, everyone. I will see you all soon. Bye.